Okay, so we'll begin, guys. Delighted to welcome everyone to this joint presentation from the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum. We're delighted tonight to have with us Professor Ryan Keating, who's a friend of mine actually, and we've known each other for many, many years. He's professor and director of the Office of Student Research at California State University in San Bernardino, and obviously teaches and researches on the Civil War era. He's the author of two books, Shades of Green, The Irish Regiments, American Soldiers and Local Communities in the Civil War Era, The Greatest Trials I Ever Had, The Civil War Letters of Margaret and Thomas Cahill, and yours affectionately, Osgood. Colonel Osgood Boyce Tracy's Letters Home from the Civil War between 1882 and 1865. He's a social historian whose work focuses on the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender in the 19th century. And he's currently working on The Silent Service, Union War Widows and the Struggle of Race in the Post-Civil War Era, which examines the experiences of Black and white Union war widows during the latter half of the 19th century. So tonight he's going to talk to us about the myths and the realities of the Irish at Gettysburg. So welcome, Dr. Keating, and thank you very much for joining. As usual, if you have questions, everybody just ask them in the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
You would think now after 5 years I would know how to unmute on Zoom. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for inviting me today. I'm so thrilled to be here. This, to be honest, is one of my bucket list items, is to talk to this historical society. When I was at Fordham, I visited it often, and I'm just thrilled to be here, and just so honored to be here to talk about my work, and to talk about sort of the larger questions of the Irish experience in the United States during the 19th century. So, as Elizabeth noted, she and I met a long time ago in the Bronx, where we were both completing our PhDs at Fordham, and we had shared interests, I think, in the immigrant experience, and a shared interest in Ireland. And so here we are today. So, inevitably, right, when people hear about my research, they say, "Oh, are you Irish?" And it's I mean, I say, "Well, I went to Holy Cross Trinity College in Fordham, and my last name is Keating. So yes, indeed, I am Irish." To which my mother always chimes in that her maiden name is Lombardi, so we can't forget the Italian heritage. And then she always mentions that I'm probably the only person to ever go to Fordham that's both a Keating and a Lombardi. Now, if you've ever been to the Fordham campus, you know that there's a Keating Hall and the Lombardi Center. I'm no relation to any of those people that were involved in that naming, but it's a running joke in my family. And I think that in part it's important to talk about who we are and why we're here and why we study what we study. And naturally, we're drawn as academics, whether professional or not, to certain things because of our background or because of experiences that we've had in our life. And for me, right, the desire to study the Irish came from my father, and I jokingly tell people, but it is a reality, that every Saturday morning he would play the Clancy Brothers very loudly on his stereo. And I was really, really, really into it. Like, I knew all the words to Patriot games when I was like 8 years old. And then I proceeded to read Jack Higgins books, right, where I was enamored with Sean Dillon, the character who's the IRA assassin, right? So I was just like super caught up with the Irish national question. And in part, his own passion for that history came from his father, and in turn from his grandfather, my great grandfather, whose name was Philip Keating. And you can see this is a census from 1901. Philip Keating, he was born in Clonmel and attended the Christian Brothers School in Clonmel before immigrating to the United States shortly before the start of the First World War. And so, you can see here the 1910 passenger list. A 17-year-old Philip landed in New York, but he was making his way to San Francisco, where his brother was a police officer. And so, we have this journey in my family from Clonmel then to Waterford. And allegedly, the story goes, and whether it's true or not, I'm not sure, but my great grandfather Philip was at the Christian Brothers High School, and he was taunted by his classmates. They called him Fatty Phil, and so he threw his books into the river and made his way to Waterford and boarded a ship to the United States, never to look back. So that's part of the family lore. But he arrived in the United States in 1910, and we find him in the 1920 census living in San Francisco after he had served in the United States Army during World War One, where he was a boxer. That was his claim to fame. And then he served in the police force in San Francisco until he passed away in the Mission District, where my grandfather and my great uncle grew up. Prior to then my grandfather left San Francisco for Los Angeles. He was a mathematician. And then from Los Angeles, he moved to Dayton, Ohio, where he worked for National Cash Register. And I always think about that. That must have been a pretty shocking transition for somebody to move from Santa Monica to Dayton, Ohio in 1954. And that's where my father grew up. And my interest in Ireland and in the study of Ireland was really cultivated at a young age, and not only with the nationalist songs and the vivid imagery of the IRA, but also tied to my dad's own retelling of family history, and in particular the lore that my great grandfather, I'm sorry, was involved in fundraising for the IRA in the 1920s from their farm in Sonoma, where my grandfather recounted there would be nationalist meetings in the basement of that farm, and money was sent from San Francisco to Ireland. And of course, we know in the larger history of the War for Independence and the subsequent struggle for freedom in the North, much of the funding came from the United States for those endeavors. And so, with that, right, we can trace my grandfather's experience and his the cultivation of the nationalist identity that was allegedly held dearly to him to his time in the Christian Brothers School. We know that in Ireland, the Christian Brothers schools were very influential at the turn of the 20th century in creating a sort of nationalist impulse, especially among young men. And so it's no surprise to me that as somebody who, as a young man, attended a school where the nationalization process occurred throughout the South, he then came to San Francisco and maintained a close connection to the cause of Irish independence. Now, so for me, right, as a young man and somebody who was fascinated by the Irish national question, I then graduated with my bachelor's degree from the College of the Holy Cross, and I determined to go to Ireland to study, and in particular to study the question of Irish nationalism and the development of Irish nationalism. And I was at Trinity that I was introduced to James Stephens and the Fenians, and these guys have sort of become my passion project and my reason for being in academia for the last 20 plus years. The Fenians were introduced to me by another faculty at Trinity as a group that very few people had really looked at deeply, and my interest in the Fenians, both in terms of their contributions to the development of the Irish national question, as well as the contribution to the American Civil War, was one that just grew over time. And when I was at Trinity, I looked at the conceptual development of the Irish nation through the lens of the leaders such as James Stephens, with a keen awareness that the organization developed both in Ireland and the United States beginning in 1858. And when I had originally started my work at Fordham, my goal was to trace the development of Fenianism in the United States before, during, and after the Civil War. And it was a particular focus here on the organization strategies of John O'Mahony, and the idea of creating an Irish American army to then go back to Ireland and fight this war for independence from England. Now, this never manifested. I think that in part what we see is that there is in the antebellum period, especially in the 4 years leading up to the Civil War, incredible activity and organization among Fenians in the United States. We have Fenian militia, recognized Fenian militia across the North that commit themselves to the cause of Irish independence and to John O'Mahony as their sort of head of that movement in the United States. And the complexities of loyalty that oftentimes define our conversations about the immigrant experience in the Civil War really come to bear during this time, because we have these Irish militia who are professing Irish national identity, contending with the growing nativist movement at the time, which it calls into question in part because of the San Patricio Battalion in the Mexican-American War. This is a group of men who desert from the United States Army to fight with the Mexican Army, and their accusations that the religious connection, right, is what drove the Irish to desert. Now, of course, this plays into the bigger nativist fear of dual loyalties, right? How can the Irish as Catholics have loyalty to the United States and to the Pope, right? And we see this time and time again over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century as defining sort of the question of Irish assimilation. So the Fenians struggled with this, and indeed the nativists who wrestled control of state governments in Connecticut and Massachusetts attempted to disband Irish militia, and the political conflict between this, openly armed Irish national group and the federal government really came to a head in 1859 with the visit of the Prince of Wales to New York City, at which time the 69th New York, led by Michael Corcoran, who ultimately became famous for his involvement in the organization of the 69th New York and fighting at Bull Run and thereafter, refused to parade in recognition or in honor of the Prince of Wales' visit. Corcoran's justification, of course, is that as an Irishman, he's not going to honor somebody who represents all that was devastating to his country. But when we look at the correspondence here, we see, in fact, O'Mahony and James Stephens, who's the head center of the whole movement in Ireland, they actually order Corcoran not to parade for the Prince of Wales, and so that there's this military order coming from these Irish nationalists that play out in real life on the streets of New York in the years before the war. And so I was very excited to study this and to trace the organization of these Fenian units and then see how they transitioned back into the post-war period in the United States and their contributions to the uprising that occurred in 1867 and thereafter. And in fact, what I found was that the Fenians, their military presence in the United States has long been relegated to sort of a comical footnote in our history. They never really in 1864 they had leased these ships and they were going to transport these men back to Ireland to fight, and that never came to fruition. And instead, Fenian leaders attempted to organize what become 3 ill-advised invasions of Canada, and the whole idea is that we're going to invade Canada, we're going to capture Canada, and trade Canada for Ireland, right? But the reporting at the time, in fact, saw this as like a parody, a comedy of errors, right? You have these accounts of the Irish, crossing into Canada, and nobody knows what's going on, and it really ends poorly for all sides, and this sort of caused the Fenians to die out in terms of their power in the post-Civil War era, their military power in the post-Civil War era. there's a bigger narrative here, right? The Fenians become the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which becomes the Irish Republican Army, which ultimately is responsible for the victory in the War for Independence, right? And so, as a scholar of the Fenians, I really see this movement as so very important to the cause of Irish nationalism, and really fundamentally responsible for independence in 1921. For the Civil War, it becomes a little bit more complex. And so, what I hope to do today is to talk about the sort of our a popular myths surrounding Irish American service versus the reality of Irish American service across the North during this time. And I'll start here with September 17th of 1862 at the Battle of Antietam, when three regiments of the Irish Brigade surged across the center of the battlefield, and during withering fire from Confederate lines anchored at the Bloody Lane, the ranks of the Irish Brigade were decimated. Thomas Marr had armed his men with buck and ball loads in order to coax them as close to the enemy as possible, and wrote in the aftermath that on this on this on the that sorry he wrote in the aftermath that it was on the recklessness of Irish soldiers in the charge that he felt confident that before such a charge, the rebel column would give way and be dispersed. William Osborne of the 29th Massachusetts recalled the charge. The volley that played out along the line towards the terrible crest made the hills ring far and wide. It was spitefully done and very effective, for instantly the Confederates fell back from the summit into the sunken road, receiving as they did so several other volleys. Another soldier of the Irish Brigade noted, the shouts of our men and their sudden dash towards the sunken road so startled the enemy that their fire visibly slackened, their lines wavered, and squads of 2 and 3 began leaving the road and running into the corn. When the Southerners finally broke, over 400 Irish volunteers lay dead or wounded. 3 months later at Fredericksburg, another 450 men, nearly 45% of the Irish Brigade, fell before Confederate guns. Writing home to his family in New York City, William Nagel of the 88th New York spoke of the devastation to his brigade. "Oh, it was a terrible day," he wrote. "The destruction of life has been fearful and nothing gained. Irish blood and Irish bones covered that terrible field today. We are slaughtered like sheep with no result but defeat. I do not know what disposition will be made of us now in our shattered condition." After the war, Colonel C.C. Sanders of the 24th Georgia recalled that the Irish Brigade would receive our well-directed fire steady and firm, and when great gaps were cut through their ranks by the artillery, would reform under incessant fire, come again, sink down and rise again, trample the dead and wounded underfoot, and press the stone wall of liquid fire, then recede a few feet and come again like an avalanche into the very jaws of death until strength and endurance failed, having been forced back by shell and the deadly minie-ball that no human could withstand. The field of battle ran great streams of blood, and the immortal Irish Brigade recoiled before the living wall of fire in glory, he wrote. I know of no charge upon the field of battle in history to compare with the charge of the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg. Marr's men, though, one outlet noted, were driven to mere slaughter, where, a correspondent in Cincinnati wrote that it can hardly be in human nature for men to show more valor or generals to manifest less judgment. At Gettysburg that July, the Irish Brigade was once again cast into the fray, though their numbers had been significantly depleted. Only 530 men mustered into battle at Gettysburg, and 202 of them died in front of Confederate lines in the wheat field and at Seminary Ridge. Private John Ryan recalled the fighting on July 2nd, where the brigade was, quote, being the whole time exposed to heavy fire of musketry, losing many men from concentrated fire of the enemy who were on both of our flanks. William Smith wrote home that the battle had, quote, knocked our regiment all to pieces. There are only 9 in our company now, and all but 108 in our regiment. The 116th Pennsylvania, Smith noted, had 900 men when we left Pennsylvania, and this fight, I think, will finish them off, and there will be no more of the 116th. Soon after the guns fell silent on the fields of Gettysburg, news outlets across the North reported in dismay the eruption of rioting and violence in New York City. In the wake of grievous losses sustained by the Irish Brigade, the riots in New York appear as the climax of Irish dissatisfaction with the war effort. Men who eagerly rushed to the defense of the Union in 1861 reconsidered their support for a war in which Irish soldiers were slaughtered like sheep in a battle for the emancipation of 4 million slaves. The implementation of the draft and growing perception of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight further alienated the impoverished masses of New York City. The riots took more than 2 weeks to quell and have since served as the pinnacle of the narrative. I'm sorry, to define the rise and fall of Irish support for the war. Right. So in 1861, when the war breaks out, the Irish rush to the flag. 1863. So we're talking about New York City, 1861. The recruiting station for the 69th New York is inundated with men who want to join the war effort. 1863, New York is in flames, and much of the rioting takes place in the poorest sectors of the city, which, of course, is where the Irish population is most heavily distributed. The draft riots are believed to represent Irish-American anger over shifting war aims and marked a turning point in the wartime relationship between this ethnic group and the broader American society. The patriotism of 61 and 62 was replaced by support for dissenting political movements such as the Peace Democrats or the Copperheads. At least this is how the traditional narrative plays out. Furthermore, the riots are believed to have influenced the post-war relationships between immigrants and native-born Americans. And in the wake of the war, we see Irish arguing time again that their sacrifice mattered, and they see their sacrifice as largely overlooked in favor of the revival of nativism and lingering questions of assimilation. In the broadest sense, the Irish experience has largely been defined by the rise and fall of ethnic loyalty that coincided with battlefield sacrifice on one hand, perceptions by some that the Irish were being used as cannon fodder on America's battlefields, and in the larger context of the Irish-American experience, as well as the experience of the men who served in the Irish Brigade and the Army of the Potomac, this narrative is understandable, right? And I think that this is where we have to talk about the myths and realities of the Irish in the Civil War, because largely the lens of the Irish experience, although over 150,000 Irish fought for the Union, the lens is largely on the Irish Brigade and the experiences of the Irish Brigade. Right? When we discuss the Irish soldiers who served in the Civil War, we must keep in mind that what oftentimes draws us to their stories are a combination of shock, right? Only 3 other units in the Union Army lost more men than the Irish Brigade. And this union was often at the center of every major battle on the Richmond-Washington front, and a sentimental attachment to Ireland, connected to the large number of people that can claim Irish ancestry, simultaneously tied to the tragedy of the Irish experience and the struggles of the Irish-American experience. Right? The experience of the Irish in Ireland during the 3 decades before the Civil War was incredibly tragic. We know this. It was defined by the Irish famine, during which time the population of 8 million on the island was cut in half, with 2 million men, women, and children dead of starvation and disease, and another 2 million forced to flee across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States and Canada. The tragedy of the famine and the sadness of the immigrant experience remained a prominent component of the Irish imagination and has for the last 200 years. And equally devastating was the English response, right? As nationalist John Mitchell famously quipped, God brought the blight, but England brought the famine. This is perhaps a perfect metaphor for the 700 years of English mistreatment of Irish Catholics that is still ongoing in some parts of the island today, as we well know. The experience of the Irish immigrants and their children is too intrinsically appealing. Fleeing tyrannical rule and social and economic devastation, the exiled Irish men and women crowded into America's urban centers, where they struggled for survival in what seems like impossible conditions found in our nation's urban slums. Compounding the economic crisis was that many of these desperately poor immigrants faced. So if we just look at this, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. But if we look at the breakdown of land in Ireland prior to the famine, we see that a majority of the Irish, of course, live on small farms, less than a quarter of an acre. They rely almost entirely on the potato, and they are renters to ever larger landholders, right? And so like the cottiers pay rent to the small farmers who pay rent to the larger farmers who pay rent to the landlords. And ultimately it's an untenable situation when the famine breaks out because all of their economic production is halted, right? So when you think about the famine, right, we have to think, sorry, I'm going a little off script here, but I just want to sort of contextualize it. When we think about the famine, right, we think about, okay, the failure of the potato crop, but the reality is the failure of the potato crop is much more devastating than just the failure of the potato. Irish men and women primarily rely on the potato. Irish men eat between 12 and 15 pounds of potatoes per day. 1 acre of sodded potato land yields 9 tons of potatoes a day. And of course, right, the potato not only feeds the people, but it feeds the farm animals, which oftentimes becomes the only connection to the market economy that these desperately poor farmers have. Right, they have a pig, they feed the pig potatoes, the pig fattens up, they sell the pig at the yearly fair, they make money. That money gets them through the lean times. On top of that, right, the only way for potatoes the only way you don't go buy potato seeds, right? You take the potato out, you cut the eyes out of the potatoes, you let them sprout, and then you plant them, right? So it's a crop that I don't know the proper farming term for it, but nevertheless, so when the potato fails, right, you lose your seedling potatoes, you lose the ability to feed the family, you lose the ability to join the market economy with the feeding of farm animals. So ultimately, it becomes an untenable situation. And of course, it's a situation that is linked in reality and in our popular imagination to the forced removal of tenants from farms, and in some cases the forced removal of these poor tenants from Ireland to the United States. Now, what we see in popular imagination is the arrival of the Irish in the United States, of course, is marked by their concentration in urban slums. In particular, there is a fascination with 5 Points at the time, in the antebellum period. And the Irish not only face, right, the economic crisis that they arrive with very little, but they also face social stigma and xenophobia that tended to follow them, right? Their religion and their alleged allegiance to the Pope, their cultural predication for alcohol, and a seemingly blind commitment to the Democrat political machines, which were tied to the general instability of the 19th century urban centers, which was often attributed to the Irish presence there, make these men and women targets of American nativism. And the open animosity between these immigrants and native-born Americans contributed to the controversial argument that emerged in the 20th century that the Irish are not viewed as white. And indeed, when we look at popular cartoons of Irish during the time, we see them often displayed in simian features. This is a great example of one, right? So we see the ape-like Irishman drunk off rum sitting on the barrel of gunpowder with a torch about to blow everything up. Right. So, I mean, that's a pretty strong message about sort of the place of the Irish in the United States. And I think that the emergence of whiteness studies, right, this idea that the Irish weren't viewed as white but became white over time as a result of economic growth and the movement into the middle class, contributed to this larger narrative that the Irish were in a really desperate situation in the United States, and struggled immensely. And then this ties into the idea that Civil War service was an attempt by these men in particular to prove their loyalty to the United States. Right, we can see here again you can see the similarities in the ways in which these immigrants are drawn. Again, the Irish American dynamite skunk, right, bred in the United States. So these are important sort of insight into the way in which American mainstream political commentators saw the Irish. I think that these immigrants arrived in reality, though, at a moment of incredible change in the United States. The growth of American industry and the growth of American urban centers, which became a home to these impoverished exiles, oftentimes led to visible and vocal ethnic wards, right? The creation of visible and vocal ethnic wards. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became synonymous with poverty, disease, and drunkenness and crime, and this only further alienated Irish Catholics from the broader Anglo-America. The rise of nativism in the form of the Know Nothing Party reflected a collective hesitancy to embrace these immigrants, at least from a national perspective, and underscored fears that Irish Catholics would cause instability if allowed to fully participate in the civil in American society. And as we see the political schisms grow in the years before the Civil War, we start to see open questions about Irish loyalty, especially considering their commitment to the Democratic Party and their hesitancy to embrace any anti-slavery advocacy. And this hesitancy, scholars often say this hesitancy is Irish racism, but I would really argue, and I really want to impress upon you all here, that it's largely due to fears of economic competition more than anything else, right? The Irish were in a tenuous place in many of these urban areas, and they saw that the emancipation would lead to economic competition for jobs in those areas. The opening of the war in 1861 for these Irish appeared an opportunity to prove their allegiance. Sociologist Warren Young has stressed the relationship between military service and sacrifice on the battlefield and notions of inclusion, and we see this in many other studies, especially studies on the theory of nation building and nationalism. The idea is that if one's willing to die on the battlefield for one's nation, adopted or otherwise, then this is proof of loyalty that can't be denied, right? You're not going to sacrifice yourself for a nation that you're not invested in. But I think that the struggle for scholars and where my work fits in is that understanding the Irish American experience in the Civil War, especially when viewed through the lens of the Irish Brigade, is that sacrifice did not appear to lend itself to acceptance, which became increasingly evident after Gettysburg. And the draft riots only appeared to reflect the failure of assimilation. So when I began my research that ultimately culminated in my book Shades of Green, one of the things that I found very striking about this larger narrative was first that in the literature, no scholar had actually defined what an Irish regiment was. And there was a tendency to stereotype and draw broad relationships between unit, symbolism, and ethnic background, relying largely on the assumption that Irish America was a cohesive immigrant community and that Irish regiments were manifestations, first and foremost, of this community. The narrative hinges upon three widely accepted observations of the immigrant community. All right. And these are observations that I'm not necessarily sure that I buy into. First, that the Irish Americans were largely alienated from American society prior to the Civil War. Second, that certain universal characteristics apply to Irish regiments, specifically that these units were primarily composed of poor, unskilled Irish-born volunteers that came from a single ethnic neighborhood. And we see this, like the 69th New York is a great example of this, right? The 69th New York is organized in 5 points. It is an almost entirely Irish-born regiment, and the soldiers there are desperately poor, right? And the lens through which scholars have always viewed Irish service was from that perspective, right? That this is replicatable at all Irish regiments across the nation, right? And then finally, that Irish Americans collectively withdrew their support for the war after the summer of 1863, right? Elizabeth only gave me 40 minutes, and now I'm running short on time. So I'm going to try to get through this quickly. But one of the things I want to point out
keep going.
Right, is that Irish America was very diverse, right? If we look at this map of the Irish population in 1870, we see that certainly there are clusters in major port areas, right? Boston, New York, Philadelphia, right? Undeniable, right? But we also have to take into account that the Irish were spread out across the United States. And of course, this map doesn't take into consideration California, because if you look at, there's a big debate in the scholarship of the Civil War, is like, why did no maps include California? But California is there, but it's not represented here. So what does this mean, and how does this impact our ability to understand and pick apart the myths of Irish service? In 1863, a newspaper in Dublin claimed that the Civil War has given us back our military reputation in its pristine luster, the valor and self-sacrifice of the Irishmen who strove and fell so heroically before the batteries at Fredericksburg and in 100 other fights, have scattered to the wind the malignant calmness of traitors and open foes, and have made manifest to the world Irish prowess. That no truer words were spoken, I don't believe, and notable here is the broader view from across the Atlantic that although the Irish Brigade was the symbol of the Irish war effort, those in Ireland recognized that this unit was only part of the broader war effort. My work focuses on three Irish regiments, the 9th Connecticut, the 17th Wisconsin, and the 23rd Illinois. All three served loyally throughout the war. And all three illustrate that there were complex realities of the ethnic experience prior to the war. They were linked to international, national worldviews, but also intimately tied to local communities. Okay, so when we look at these three regiments, why did I choose them? None of them served in the Irish Brigade, so this was how I chose these regiments. And so I don't want to look at the Irish Brigade. I want to look at other regiments simply because I think that the Irish Brigade has been overused in scholarship and is not representative of the broader Irish experience. The way that I look at it is very similar to this idea, like if somebody came to, so I'm in San Bernardino, it's outside of LA, 50 miles outside of LA. If you picked up somebody that had never been to the United States and dropped them in LA, and then their whole view of the United States was from that experience in LA, we know it wouldn't be accurate, right? Because of the myriad of experiences in different spaces, right? LA is not the same as Texas, is not the same as Ohio, is not the same as New York, is not the same as Florida, right? We recognize that as a reality of both the size and scope and scale of our nation. So seeing the Irish Brigade as the only lens through which we judge Irish service is problematic because the experience of the Irish in New York is intrinsically different than the experiences of Irish in other places, right? And we have to be willing to recognize that, and we have to be willing to understand that the Irish experience was much more nuanced and much more tied to local communities than it was to sort of a national Irish community. In Illinois, in 1861, Governor Yates called up 6,000 volunteers, and by April of 1865, the Irish had responded with enthusiasm. Communities from across Illinois were reporting that men were joining to go join James Mulligan right here with the cross, to join James Mulligan in the organization of an Irish brigade in Chicago. Mulligan was ordered to fully equip the men under his command, the Shields Guards, which was a Fenian militia that had become a prominent militia in Chicago prior to the war. Mulligan was a prominent lawyer, and his parents had immigrated from Ireland. He was a proud Democrat and Fenian, and he was one of the figureheads of the Fenian leadership of the Midwest. Into Mulligan's headquarters pours letters from Irish across the Midwest, who have heard about his acceptance into the Union Army and are talking about the several young Irishmen from these various communities that are going to enthusiastically join the Irish regiment. One wrote, "We would very much like to join an Irish regiment in preference to any others." Another wrote, "I've seen it telegraphed from Washington that your brigade was accepted, and being desirous of enrolling my name amongst a band of men activated by such noble and holy impulses, I now address you. I've been in the militia service of my adopted country since I was 16. I saw service in Nicaragua. If you, Colonel Mulligan, can afford me such a position in your brigade as past services and military education would warrant me, I shall hold myself ready for marching orders." When the 23rd Illinois left Chicago in the summer of 1861, headed for Springfield, Missouri, they represented men from not only the city of Chicago, but Detroit, Ottawa, Earlville, and a dozen other small cities from across Illinois. In Connecticut, we see the same impulse. Irishmen rally around the flag, and they flock to a command led by Thomas Cahill, who is a colonel of the Irish militia of New Haven. Governor Buckingham in Connecticut recognized the need to bring the Irish into the fold to support the war effort, and he offered the Irishmen an opportunity to elect their own officers and form their own regiment. The Irish population, noted the Middletown Constitution, are unanimous in their wish and determination to support the government, right? And this was an effort to quell questions of Irish assimilation, Irish loyalty in the immediate aftermath of Fort Sumter. In spite of prophecies to the contrary, they noted, we have not heard of a single Irishman who has shown a disposition to prove false to the stars and stripes. When the Emmett Guards of New Haven volunteered their services, some regiments saw the irony in this action, recalling that the arms of this company, just lost my space. The arms of this company, as are composed of Catholic adopted citizens, were taken from them under a boldly imputed doubt of their loyalty. Let justice be done by a generous acknowledgement of their loyalty and the restoration of their character. Such soldiers should not be spared. None in Connecticut, another editor wrote, hastens to don the armor of his country and to strike more in her defense as the much maligned and proscribed Irish Catholic. Ultimately, the Ninth Connecticut was sent to Louisiana. They were involved in the occupation of New Orleans, and they, I guess, are notorious for having more court-martials than any other regiment in the whole Union Army, which I don't believe has anything to do with their Irishness, but rather the fact that you have a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds who are in New Orleans and are just out of control. In Wisconsin, the 17th Wisconsin organized from a very dispersed and diverse ethnic community. The 17th Wisconsin didn't organize until later, almost a year later, and really drew on the experiences of the 69th New York and the 17th Illinois and the success of those regiments in battle as the motivating force behind the formation of this regiment. And one of the interesting things about the Irish in Wisconsin, or the formation of the Irish regiment in Wisconsin, is it's really like a fanboy sort of thing. What happens is the Irish are watching the success of other Irish regiments, and they're like, well, we need a regiment of our own. It's very much like high schools that take on the name like Notre Dame or the Fighting Irish to try to replicate what the University of Notre Dame does. And so I just want to give you some visual, right? What I did was I built a database of all the soldiers that fought in these units, and I want to give you sort of a visual of what we're seeing to try to get to the crux of the myth of the Irish experience, right? If we look here, so the yellow is men of Irish birth, the red is men not of Irish birth, and so this is the formation of the 23rd Illinois, and what's particularly important about this is we see that Chicago has a large presence in the regiment of over 1,000 men, but it's by no means the sole ethnic ward or ethnic neighborhood that is contributing to this Irish brigade, right? We see men coming from across Illinois, across Indiana, and across Michigan, and we also see a lot of diversity in terms of the ethnic background, right? Same in Connecticut, right? This is the residency of the Ninth Connecticut, right? We see that there's no single ethnic ward that contributes to the regiment in its entirety. So it's a myth in many ways that Irish regiments were formed in an Irish neighborhood, right? Irish neighborhoods and Irish spaces contributed some men, but did not sustain regiments as a whole, right? So in this case, the phenomenon of the 69th New York is really an anomaly rather than the norm when we look at regimental recruiting. Irish recruiting took place across states and in some cases outside of states. This is the 17th Wisconsin. Again, the yellow reflects Irish-born soldiers. The red reflects non-Irish-born soldiers. And you can see in the 17th Wisconsin that it is incredibly diverse. And it also reflects sort of the diversity of that state as well. So one of the things that we can see is when we break down the data, right, we can see that this shows I did a database of these cities, right, to understand the number of Irish men of military age in these cities, the number of men who volunteered from the cities, and then the percentage of Irish-born soldiers from the town. And one of the things that I want to get at is that the idea of an Irish regiment was sometimes more of a perception than a reality, right? So if you look at recruiting from Meriden, for example, Okay, Meriden, Connecticut, it's a small town. There's 2,600 men of military age in the town in 1860. 495 Irish men of military age in the town, 19% of the population. But when you look at recruiting from the Ninth Connecticut, right, 86% of the men who enlist in the Ninth Connecticut from Meriden are Irish, right? So the perception on the ground in Meriden is that the regiment is largely Irish, right? So you have these local perceptions that impact and influence, right, how regiments are viewed, right? That doesn't necessarily reflect the construction of the regiment as a whole, right? We see the same thing in Ottawa, Illinois, right? 62% of the men who enlisted in the 23rd Illinois were of Irish descent, and only 27% of the men of military age in the town were of Irish descent, right? Same with Janesville, Wisconsin, right? 19 of the 20 men who enlisted in the 17th Wisconsin were of Irish, were born in Ireland, right? When the Irish only made up 14% of the men in the town, right? So the perception is that it's mostly Irish in these areas, but that perception is not necessarily reflecting in the actual composition of the unit. Another thing that I really want to stress is that the Irish regiments were not all poor, unskilled laborers. If we look at the breakdown of volunteers in the regiments, we see a very diverse economic cross section, and in fact, most of the soldiers who enlisted can be identified as having a trade, even if that trade was an unskilled trade. It was listed as a trade. So when you look at the muster and descriptive roles, men identified as having trades, right? And it wasn't just poor, impoverished men with no jobs that were enlisting into these regiments because they had no other option, right? And that's really important. And this leads to another point. I'm sorry. My mouse just went great. Whoop. I don't know what's going on. So that leads to another point is that, sorry, that leads to another point is that when we look at these communities, right? When we look at these communities of men, okay, one of the things that we see is that the Irish in these communities outside of New York, Boston, Philadelphia are established in the communities. They're part of the communities. With the exception of the experience in New Haven, I found very little evidence that the Irish were actually impacted in any tangible way by nativism. And in fact, most Irish in these areas, in these small cities, were instrumental in building these towns, instrumental in building these cities, were celebrated by the communities as they marched to war, and were vibrant players in the local economy and local political sphere. And I say this in tandem with the fact that when the draft riots broke out in 1863, the Irish in Connecticut, the Irish in Illinois, the Irish in Michigan, the Irish in Wisconsin unanimously rejected the draft riots. Unanimously rejected the draft riots. There's speeches, there's editorials that distance themselves, the Irish and the Catholics in these places, from what they term all that class that infests New York. They don't see themselves as the same. And this impacts too the ways in which the people back at home talk about the service of these regiments. The 17th the 23rd Illinois served heroically at Springfield, Illinois, the Battle of Springfield, where they stopped Sterling Price's invasion of Missouri, and they surrendered. They surrendered the entire regiment. Without water and without powder, they were compelled to surrender. In the wake of their surrender, James Mulligan was lauded as a national hero. Across the United States, newspapers proclaim him to be the essence of what it means to be American. So you have this very negative act of surrendering, an act that oftentimes was tied to a lack of commitment, a lack of enthusiasm for the war effort, and it's being repackaged in popular press as being truly representative of what it means to be American. And Mulligan becomes not only an Irish American hero, but an American hero in the wake of the war. At the Battle of Baton Rouge, the 9th Connecticut is lauded for their saving the battle, right? It's a minor skirmish, but those at home celebrate this as evidence of what these Irish American soldiers can do under fire. and really the negative impulses that we see in the wake of Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg don't trickle into the rhetoric at home on the home front. The 17th Wisconsin, their war starts in a horrible way. On March 18th, which happens to be the day after St. Patrick's Day, the regiment's supposed to leave board trains to go to Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing. The regiment doesn't want to go because many of the regiments don't want to go because they haven't been paid and they don't think it's fair as citizen soldiers to be forced to leave the state without being paid. And what are their families going to do? Right. So, in the St. Patrick's Day celebrations, and as some suggested out of protest, they light the barracks on fire and then they mutiny. The entire regiment mutinies. And what is interesting about this is like the surrender of the 23rd Illinois, a mutiny, and in particular a mutiny of an Irish regiment, should, if we understand the relationship between the Irish, as past scholars have, that mutiny should be seen as evidence of ethnic disloyalty. But in reality, the mutiny was seen as evidence of their Americanness. That in the press, even the governor comes out, the governor of the state of Wisconsin comes out and he says, "You're right. You shouldn't have to leave the state without being paid. That is your right as a citizen soldier." Right. So this action, I mean, it's a mutiny so bad that they have to bring the 23rd Illinois from Chicago to Madison, and the guys from the 17th Wisconsin are forced to board trains at the point of bayonet. But in the press, this action is not viewed as evidence of ethnic disloyalty. It's not viewed as evidence of Irish proclivities or fondness for alcohol. It's viewed as evidence of how citizen soldiers should act and have the right to act based on their contractual relationship with the government. And I find this to be fascinating, right? And there's a whole history of sort of imagining the citizen soldier in this time. But I just want to reinforce this as sort of dispelling the stereotypes that we have when we move away from the lens of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and we start to understand, right, that these Irish soldiers and these Irish regiments experienced the war in very local ways. Their successes at Vicksburg, at Corinth, in the Shenandoah Valley, in Louisiana, even in spaces where it's a really negative experience, right? So the 9th Connecticut is outside Vicksburg in April of 1862 and loses almost a third of their men to disease. But it's never reported negatively in the press back at home. Their service is continually celebrated as evidence of loyalty, in spite of the realities of, we're talking about, loss of soldiers at the same rate that the Irish Brigade lost soldiers at those major battles on the Richmond-Washington front. And ultimately and sadly, I think the reality is that the service and sacrifice of the men from places outside of the traditional Irish enclaves were overlooked in the histories and the writing of the histories of the Civil War in favor of the experiences of these more prominent regiments, and that ultimately detracted from our scholarly understanding of the experiences of these men. But I do urge you all here to really think of the Irish American experience in much more diverse ways, right? Move away from just simply viewing it as this plight of the urban pioneer, which is how often we have this plight to earn assimilation, this desperate need to prove one's whiteness, because in reality, right outside of these spaces, the Irish tend to be much more intimately integrated and much more a part of these communities than we've previously considered. Now, certainly, right, you can always point to other examples that show the struggles, and I'm not trying to downplay the realities and the struggles of the immigrant experience by any means, but I do want to really reiterate, right, that when you look at smaller towns, there's just opportunity. There's opportunity. There is employment. There's jobs. Like if you look at Watertown, Connecticut, for example, I think something like 75% of the Irish are unskilled laborers, but 60% of those unskilled laborers own property. That's pretty significant, right? That's a pretty significant statistic, right? You can be unskilled, but that doesn't mean you're desperately poor. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind as we talk about the Irish experience in the 19th century. So that's sort of my 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 spiel, if you
Your
will.
spiel, yeah. Well, I think it's fascinating, Ryan, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions for you. So those of you who are online with us, if you'd like to, either type it into the chat or to the Q&A. But it's a fascinating look at how, identity can be more fragmented and more rounded than, particularly as you say, like American Irish historians often look at the ethnicity and how important that is. And again, it goes to show how different the experience in a city can be. So, like even New York from Boston, but upstate New York or Connecticut, rural towns, so different from the cities. So, those men in, particularly the three towns that you looked at, are they also, do you think, like members of fraternal, the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick or the AOH, or like how non-Irish are they in their town aside from the
Yeah.
soldiering and the war?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
no, that's a great question. So, what I found is that in many of these regiments, there was a direct correlation between involvement in the Fenian and
Mm.
H organizations to officer positions in the regiments, right? So there's that political connection. So in the 23rd Illinois and the 9th Connecticut in particular, right? We have rosters of the Fenian militia that were published in the newspaper The Phoenix, which was printed in Brooklyn. So we have those rosters, so you can trace men's enlistment into Union service, and in particular their emergence as officers in those regiments. So I mean that's pretty clear to me that at least at the top level in Connecticut and Illinois, at the officer ranks, regimental and company, there tends to be that link. Among the soldiers themselves, it seems much more diverse. Um, there's very few accountings of sort of involvement in any sort of fraternal organization. In fact, I mean, there's very few accountings of any sort of religious affiliation, right? We know that all three regiments had Catholic chaplains, but really it's of secondary, if anything, concern to the men and even the officers. There's no discussion of it in any of the regimental communications. And so, in fact, in my book, I didn't talk about the Catholic Church as part of these regiments because there was no evidence, one way or another, that said the priests were impactful or were tied to the regiment in intimate ways. And tracing those fraternal organizations, I think, is difficult, right? And the fluidity of those fraternal organizations makes it even more challenging, right? So, what we can see, and then that's also compounded by the fact that the Irish tended to be really mobile. Most scholars don't see the Irish as very mobile prior to the Civil War, but the reality is, right, if you look at these smaller towns and communities, you see the Irish are actually really engaged, and many Irish are engaged in westward movement. And we can track this in the census. The way that I tracked it was like, well, where are your kids born, right? So, if you have a kid born in Maine, New York, Ohio, and you live in Wisconsin, right, then you can see travel over time. And another way that I traced it was through the pension files. So I looked at the pension files of the soldiers from these three regiments, and in those pension files, to prove one's injury, they oftentimes had to have a pretty detailed account of their lives before and after the war, including where they lived, their employment, their relationship in organizations, and that's something that I actually didn't see. Like in support of pensions, rarely did men have other like members of fraternal organizations write in defense. So it wasn't really a part of the lived experience that I found. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it wasn't in my
But isn't
research.
that
So
absolutely fascinating? Like to think that, and Tyler Ambender is doing a little bit of work on this too in New York. I don't know if you've read his latest book, basically how the famine Irish, built New York or whatever. It is excellent book. But this idea like of the mobility of the Irish, and I suppose, because I'm a New York City historian, I think they all come here and stay here, But there is this idea of, so they're just following opportunity then, right? Like, are they changing jobs? Are they more entrepreneurial than we've previously given them credit for? Which I think came out in Ann Bender's research, like that, some of them are opening stores or working in breweries or they're working as cart people. We have this idea that they're all unskilled ditch diggers, and that may not be necessarily true.
Oh, I mean, So what I found is that it tends, and it differs by city, right? So,
Yeah.
in the rural Midwest, the Irish tend to be more skilled, right? And
Okay.
that's just a reality of, so as we see the westward movement, the Irish come and they start as like, canal diggers in some of these areas, right? So that's the
Mhm.
history of these towns. Oh, the first Irish arrived when the canal started to be dug. But the reality is, right, is that as these cities are growing, they need skilled workers, right? They need
Mhm.
carpenters, they need blacksmiths, so on and so forth, and the Irish are following the jobs, right? So there
Mhm.
may be the connection because family members or friends might have been there at the very
Mhm.
beginning, but they're coming and they're employed. In the cities, right? So like we know, like Waterford, Connecticut had a vibrant carriage making industry, like a really vibrant carriage making industry, and you see the Irish in those spaces, right? Not necessarily skilled workers, but working in the carriage industry. And then there's also these crazy connections, like when you have like an Irish, there's one company in the Ninth Connecticut. The captain was a foreman at the carriage industry, and then like 10 guys joined with him because they all worked together, right?
Yeah.
So we see those relationships. We see those relationships as well. But in terms of just the demographics of some of these cities, it's shocking, right? I went into this study with a very strong preconception that the
Yeah.
Irish were, the Irish or the famine Irish were horribly poor across the nation, and the reality is that, not to downplay the poverty and the
Mhm.
struggle in on the East Coast, but outside of the East Coast, it's way different, and
Right.
and then that ties to sort of the impact of nativism, right? Because if you're integrated in these communities, right? If you're an integral member of these community, you're a respected tradesperson, right? The nativist rhetoric is not going to trickle down to those spaces.
Yeah.
And I would I urge everybody to think, right, that the reality is 19th century Americans, indeed Americans now, we're much more concerned about what's going on in our own backyard than we are about national politics, right? In many
Mhm.
cases, right? And
Mhm.
19th century folks, right, most never traveled more than 20 miles outside of their towns.
Yeah.
Uh, they were tied to what's going on in their towns, and if you're in Earlville, Illinois, where it's relatively prosperous, like the
Yeah.
nativist rhetoric is not going to ring true to people there.
Yeah. Or the Irish as bogeyman is not your experience. Like, yeah.
The Irish and but also too, right? So much has been made about Irish racism.
Mm.
The reality is that most of the Irish that I studied most likely never saw a black person in their life, right? So if you look at Milwaukee, for example, Milwaukee's the largest industrial town that feeds the 17th Wisconsin. In the 1860 census, there were 4 black men of military age in the city of Milwaukee,
Milwaukee.
right? So even this idea that the Irish didn't support abolition, or they didn't support Republican politics because they were afraid of economic competition. Like,
Yeah.
you can't be afraid of economic competition that doesn't exist, right? So,
Yeah.
so maybe the political rhetoric from the top down is saying fear the competition, but the lived reality of these individuals would have
Yeah.
been much different, much
Hmm.
different.
Hmm. Hmm. I think that has fascinating kind of implications for our study then going into the 20th century too, really. And just in terms of their military service, until somebody interrupts me with questions, do they enlist for like the 1 or 2 years? Do they re-enlist? And does anyone stay in the army?
Yeah, so the initial enlistment, so the 23rd Illinois enlists as a 1-year regiment initially,
Mm.
and then they reform after they surrender. So they're
Mm.
paroled from Springfield, and they reform as a 3-year regiment.
Oh,
And then in '64, there's a campaign to reenlist as a veteran volunteer, and most of the soldiers do so. Same with the Ninth Connecticut. The Ninth Connecticut originally enlists as a 3-year regiment, and they become veteran volunteers when they're transferred to Virginia in '64. They're transferred, not they're not on the Richmond Washington front, so they're in Deep Bottom Virginia, which is south of Petersburg.
oh,
And then the 17th of Wisconsin is a 3-year regiment. But what's interesting about the 17th of Wisconsin is that by 1864, you have a lot of drafted men or 1-year conscripts. So basically, if you want to buy yourself out of the draft, you can have a 1 year replacement. So there's
Mhm.
actually a sizable number of drafted men in the 17th Wisconsin, which is pretty interesting and pretty unique in terms of the what it tells us about sort of the organization of these regiments.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And
so
then my last question just about kind of the soldiers' experience, and you may not have come across it, but we had a guy last year, Jonathan Jones, maybe it was 2 years ago, who was looking at he called it America's first opioid crisis, and he was talking about soldiers, after the war. Actually, what was surprising about his work, he was saying how we have this image of, them being operated on the field and chewing on a piece of tree, but they had microscopes on the battlefield. And so actually the medical technology was quite good, for triage on site. But there is this issue with opioids afterwards. And he was looking at, and again, maybe it's a class thing. I wonder, were the higher ups, the officers and stuff, did they have better access to drugs afterwards? But have you looked at that, and maybe you've seen some of that in the
uh,
pension
no, I
crowds?
mean this is a really important question. So there's been a bunch of really good books that have come out about medicine in the Civil War.
Mm.
Ryan Craig Miller has a really amazing book on amputation. I mean, it's real gnarly.
Yeah.
In terms of just we have these conceptions about amputation and
Yeah.
versus the reality. So one of the things that and not to toot my own horn, but one of
But
the well, I mean, but it's just the reality of my research is
yeah.
that because so when I started doing these regiments, when I started looking at them, I found very few traditional primary sources, right? So there were very few letter collections, very few diaries. I'm looking at 5,500 men in these three regiments that fought over the course of the war, and there were probably 8 diaries and letter collections total.
Wow.
Uh,
Yeah.
and this is sort of a part and parcel of the larger problem with studying
Yeah.
Irish soldiers and other ethnic groups, right? So the problem with studying the USCT is you don't have these large letter collections like you have in
Mm.
some of the other regiments where you have the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who are
Yeah. Writing
who
home. Yeah. Yeah.
it's conscious. And it's not that the guys aren't writing. It's not that the guys aren't
Yeah.
writing, but I think that the reality is that if the Irish moved a lot, right?
Yeah.
There's the economic reality, especially after the Civil War. And the reality is that, if you're moving from apartment to apartment, you're not
Keeping the
carrying
letters.
around
Yeah.
your letters, right?
Yeah.
People that keep their letters are the ones,
Yeah.
they have the house that the family's lived in for,
Yeah.
50 years, and they know that they're going to be safe there, and also,
Mm.
right, there's a Victorian culture that was really tied to sort of letter writing and diarying. That
Yeah.
was
Keepsakes and stuff. Yeah.
how certain groups were, acculturated at the time. So because there aren't a lot of letter collections, right? Where are the sources? And one of the sources that I really relied on was the federal pension files. And so in my research, I think I've looked at more pensions than probably anybody else other than Damian Shields, who's doing really
Like
great.
prolific. I know. Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
incredible. So me and
Yeah.
him.
Jamie is a machine. He's
I
going to
know.
be on soon with us. Yeah.
Oh, he is. That's
Yeah.
awesome. If
Yeah.
we had a competition of who's looked at more pension files, and we might be neck and neck. But
Yeah.
and so one of the things that I would say is that there is a preconception of that the Irish veterans struggled after the war. And there's accounts of sort of like soldiers' homes in New Haven, right, where Irish veterans are breaking out of the soldiers' homes and falling drunk on
Mm.
the train tracks and getting run over by trains, and it's very
Oh.
much a negative thing. And there's a huge subfield in Civil War history that looks at the dark turn of the war, which in part traces the experiences of veterans and highlights sort of the struggles of veterans after the war, and in particular the struggles of veterans with alcoholism and so on
Yeah.
and so forth, opioid use, finding employment, and things like that. What I think that you find in the pension files is a much more vibrant accounting of life. The way I look at it is like many of the studies on the Dark Turn rely on records from soldiers and sailors' homes or hospitals, and
Mhm.
that by nature is a flawed group, right? Because
Mhm.
everybody in a hospital is sick, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
you don't go to a hospital, you don't go to a soldier's home. In most cases, you don't go to a soldier's home unless you're destitute, right? Because there's rules and regulations that
Yeah.
come with the soldier's home. You have to, it's very crazy.
Yeah, yeah, strict. Hmm. Hmm.
And so, if you're just looking at that sample, yeah, naturally you're going to find soldiers who are addicted to, opioids
Mm.
or alcohol, and so on and so forth, right? And that's not to again diminish their experiences and diminish the impact that alcohol has in the latter half of the 19th century. But
Mm.
my comment about alcohol would be that life is really difficult for these people, and so it's of no surprise that they drank alcohol to deal with the everyday aches and pains of hard labor. But in looking at pension files, one of the things that you see, right, is very vibrant post-war lives. Even men who are wounded try to advance themselves, right? So when you look at the reason why men are moving, right, they're moving to pursue jobs, they're moving to work for former comrades, they're moving to purchase land or other endeavors, right? And so it's I think that in understanding that sort of the dark experience, right, veterans did struggle, right,
Mm.
as a result of their experiences in the war, right? It was a brutal war, not just on the battlefield, but the day to day life was incredibly difficult for these men, right? Um, and they there were lingering issues that they faced and injuries that they faced after the war, but also keep in mind that they went from the military back to incredibly dangerous, hard jobs. You
Yeah,
know, like,
yeah.
like you're a 22-year-old who's been discharged from the military and you're going back to work in a sawmill. It's not like you're going back to there's
Gucci
that.
number somewhere.
Yeah, it's not like they're
Yeah.
going home to sleep in their feather beds,
Mhm.
with three
Mhm.
square meals a day, right? It's very difficult work, and I think that one of the things the pension files attest to is the physical toll of life in the 19th century. You know, yes, if you lost your arm on the battlefield, right, that's a wound that's very visible. But there's physical wounds that are both tied to the war and tied to life
Mhm.
that men and women struggle with immensely, and it does not sound enjoyable.
No, no. Well, I won't delay people anymore. I think they didn't have questions, so you obviously were very thorough. We're going to post this talk on both the YouTube channel for the Irish American Heritage Museum up in Albany, but ourselves, and hopefully, Ryan, someday you'll be live and in person here in New York when you get back over.
I would love to be. The only benefit of Zoom is that my hair looks fuller than it is in real life.
I know, yeah, I have to get
I,
better lighting in here.
I prefer this modality.
I know,
But
well, no, it'll be great to see you and have you here in person. But thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Dr. Keating. That was amazing. And we'll probably have you back. I'm very interested in this new book about the women. I think that's a great way of
I would
looking at the topic. Yeah.
love to come talk about my next book.
Good, good.
Uh,
And Virginia says very interesting and a nuanced picture of the subject. So thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. I appreciate it. I appreciate you all taking time. I know that it's a busy time of the year, and really it means a lot. I love to talk about my work, and I don't get to nearly enough. Uh, Nobody in my family cares what I do.
Well, they've probably been listening
No,
to it for too
no,
long.
no, they all. So my wife is her mom is from Cuba and her dad was from India.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
so
They
they're
don't care.
my children, my children have like much more direct connections to those countries than they do to Ireland, but they tell
Yeah.
everybody they're Irish and
Oh,
they
yay. I know it. We're very
celebrate their
insidious that
Irish
way.
heritage.
I know.
So
It's
I guess I've
amazing.
done
I
a
don't
good
know how we
job.
do it. Okay,
Um,
well, good night. I'm going to just say, actually, we're back next week in person. If you're in New York on the 21st, we've got Dr. Gillian O'Brien from Ireland giving a talk about Ireland's most haunted spots. And then on Wednesday, we've got Irish Ghost Stories of New York here in person. And I am recording a talk with the Ulster, the National Museum of Ulster to talk about, ghost stories and things. So we'll put that up, but there won't be an opportunity to join because we're pre-recording. And we're back in November with an online Zoom on Archbishop McQuaid and the mother and babies and adopting babies into America. So that'll be quite heartening in mid-November. But all of these will be posted on our website. So thanks very much. Good night, Ryan. Have a great weekend. And thank you everyone for joining. Lovely to see you all. Take care.
Wonderful to see you. We'll have to get together soon.
Definitely. Thank you. Bye bye.